We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Dalet Amud Beis in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 74b. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that Kol ha'asurin lavo b'kohol, anybody who's asur, forbidden to enter into the community, so mutarim lavo zeh b'zeh. The Mishnah said that it's mutter for them to marry one another. And then the Mishnah went on to say that Rabbi Yehuda osir, Rabbi Yehuda prohibits it. And the Gemara wanted to try to figure out what exactly does the Mishnah mean. Because if it just means to say that the various individuals like mamzerim, nesinim, etc., that can't enter the community are allowed to marry one another, that we've already stated before. And furthermore, what exactly does it mean, Rabbi Yehuda osir? And the Gemara had suggested that maybe Rabbi Yehuda osir is referring to the sheet that we found Rabbi Yehuda earlier. Rabbi Yehuda said that a ger is osir to marry a mamzeres, and so maybe Rabbi Yehuda is referring to that. But the problem is the Mishnah doesn't seem to be referring to that kind of a situation. And so now Rabbi Yehuda answers, Rabbi Yehuda the Amora, he answers as follows. Hachi Kamar, this is what's going on in the Mishnah, this is what the Mishnah is saying. Kol ha'asurim lavo bekahal kahuna. Anybody who's asur to enter into the community of the kahuna. Anybody who's not allowed to marry a kohen. And ma'ininu, what's the example of that? Giores pechusami bas shalosh shana v'yom echad. We're talking about a giores, a woman who converted, and she's less than 3 years old in a day. She's a young girl. Udelo Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, not like Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's shita. We'll see Rashi in a moment. But in any case, over there, any of that kind of a situation, mutarim lavo zebazeh. They're mutter to marry. They're mutter to marry one another. And Rashi over here explains. Hachi Kamar, this is what the Mishnah is saying. Kilomar, what the Gemara now is saying, what it means to say is as follows. Liolam Rabbi Yehuda ager b'mamzeres koi. Really, Rabbi Yehuda is going on the case of ger b'mamzeres. Again, as we've seen earlier, Rabbi Yehuda holds a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeres because the ger is also considered to be the community, is also considered to be the kohol, and the mamzeres is not allowed to enter into the kohol. That's what the Tanakama said. The Shama leila Tanakama da'ayriba, because Rabbi Yehuda did hear that the Tanakama was talking about that. V'hai bekol de ko'amrin. Now, when it says in the Mishnah kol, because it says kol ha'asurin lovo bekol, what does that mean? It means kahal kahuna. We're talking here about the community of kahuna, meaning to say the kohen asur b'gioris, because a kohen is asur b'gioris, meaning a ger is somebody who is asur lovo bekol. Why is the ger asur lovo bekal? Because the ger is not allowed to marry a kohen, and a kohen is asur b'gioris. V'afilu pechusa, that's specifically a kohen to a gioris, but in any case, you see a giores is somebody she can't marry the kahal kahuna, and therefore we were referring to a ger, we were referring to giores, and that's what the Tanakama was saying is mutter lavo zebazeh, meaning the Tanakama was saying a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres. That's how Rabbi Yehuda understood the Tanakama, and therefore the Tanakama is saying that's not the case. A ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeres. V'afilu pchusa mibas gimel shanim. Now the point over here is this is true when we talk about a kohen is asur b'giores. That's even a giores that's less than 3 years old. The lav bas biyahi, because she's not able to have relations at that age, she's too young. Ve'ein sham mishum chashash zenus. There's no concern that this is a zona. There's no concern of znus. Techsiv kim besulos mizera beis Yisrael. And so therefore, even that situation, again talking about a giores pechusa mibas shalosh shana v'yom echad, that's asur lavo bekal kahuna, and that's what we were referring to. Udelok Rabbi Shimon, and the Gemara said that wouldn't be following Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. The Amar lekamon bepirkin, because Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai actually says giores pechusa mibas gimel ksheir lekahuna. He says that a giores younger than 3 years old is ksheir lekahuna, but that's not what the Tanakama of our Mishnah holds. The Tanakama of our Mishnah holds that a kohen is always asur in a giores, even if she's less than 3 years old. And Rashi continues, Vachi Kamar, so therefore this is what the Mishnah is saying, Kol ha'asurin lavo bekal kahuna. Anybody who's not able to enter into the community of the kahuna, again talking about a giores, umayniu demarbi hay klola yesrol rishonim sha'asurin bekal yisrael giores. And what are we talking about? We're adding on from the earlier cases. We're talking about a giores shepechusim bas shalosh shanim, who's less than 3 years old. The kol shekein yisrael bas shalosh shanim, and certainly if she's more than 3 years old, mutarin hanach asurin gioros umamzerim munasini shtuki lavo zebazeh. The Mishnah is going that step further and saying they're all mutter to marry one another, even the gioris. The gioris and the mamzerim, the nasinim, the shtuki, they're all allowed to marry one another. That's what the Tanakama was saying, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda is responding to, and he's saying a ger is asur to marry a mamzeris. But the Gemara continues, V'nukma b'bas shalosh shanim v'yom echad v'afilu Rav Shimon ben Yochai. Why don't you just say that our Mishnah is talking about a Giores that's 3 years old in a day or older, and it will follow even Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, meaning when the Mishnah says, Kol ha'asurin lavo b'kahal, it means specifically a Giores that's older than 3 years old. She's not allowed to marry into the community of the Kahuna, and we're not talking about a Giores that's less than 3 years old, because she actually is mutter to the Kahuna. And the Gemara says to that, Im kain mitzidot ta'avr. If you said that, so from the Mishnah itself, the Mishnah would be broken. You wouldn't be able to explain the Mishnah, because we would say as follows, that the only reason is because she's 3 years old or older. That's the only reason that we say she's asur lavo, she's not allowed to enter into the community of the kuna, and that she's mutter lavo zeh bazeh, she's mutter to be with a mamzer, etc. But that would imply that if she was less than 3 years old, the muteres lavo bekal kuna, that she's actually allowed to enter into the community of the kuna, asura lavo zeh bazeh, so she'd actually be asur to marry those who are not allowed into the community. But that's problematic. But that's not true when you have a girl who's a Giores, who's less than 3 years old in a day. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, to muteres lavo bekal kuna, she's actually allowed to enter into the community of the kahuna. Umutaras lavo zeh bazeh. The halacha actually is she's muter lavo zeh bazeh. She is allowed to marry those who are not allowed in terms of the community, and so therefore that would be internally contradictory. It would be a problem. And Rashi explains, Asurin lavo zeh bazeh. Again, the implication is that less than 3 years old is going to be problematic, it's going to be usur. Bitmia, that's a wonderment. Hiba mamzer mamzer ba. She's going to be usur to a mamzer is going to be usur to her. V'haregioris v'chulu dekevan to kahal gerim lav kahalu. Because since you're saying the community of gerim is not considered the kahal, loshna pchusa loshna yaseira. It shouldn't matter if she's less than 3 years old or more than 3 years old. V'al karchach tanad didan, and it has to be according to our Mishnah. Midashari yaseira al bas shalosh lamamzer, because the Tan of our Mishnah is saying that if she's older than 3 years old, she's allowed to be with a mamzer. That's the whole point. Since she is usur to the community of the kuna, she's allowed to be to a mamzer. Shmami no islay kahal gerim loik recall. You see that the community of gerim is not called a community. It's not called the kahal, and that should apply less than 3 years old as well. But again, that's not going to work, because it's going to come out. If you're going to say that our Mishnah is going according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is only talking about older than 3 years old, it would sound like less than 3 years old actually is prohibited to marry the mamzer, which would not be true. But the Gemara continues, Uchlalahu, but is this really an actual rule? As Rashi says, Uchlalahu bitmiya decholho asurin lakoin mutar lamamzer. What we're saying now is that anybody who's prohibited to a kohen, that's what we're talking about by the Giores. So the Tanakam of the Mishnah was saying is mutar lamamzer, is mutar to marry those who are excluded from the community. Is that really a rule? Decholho asurim lavo bekal kahuna. Anybody who's not allowed to enter the community of the kahuna, mutar and lavo zeh bazeh, is now allowed to marry one another, meaning all those other individuals who can't enter into the community. V'harei almono, grusha, v'chalola, v'zona. What about all of these cases which are prohibited to kahuna? Almona, grusha, chalola, and zona. The asurim lavo bekal kahuna. They are usher to enter into the community of the kahuna. V'asurim lavo zeh bazeh. It's usher for them to enter into those who are not allowed to enter into the community. And the Gemara continues, Vesuin further, Hamutter Aser, it sounds like anyone who's mutter, anyone who's allowed to enter the community of the kahuna, so they're Aser to be with a mamzer and all of those who are excluded from the community. V'harei ger, but then we go back to the case of the ger. What about the ger? Shem mutter b'kohenes, again a ger is mutter to marry a kohenes. That's talking again a situation where the kohenes, you're talking about the female, that prohibition doesn't apply to her. A ger is mutter b'kohenes, mutter b'mamzeres, but the ger is also mutter b'mamzeres, and so therefore the rule doesn't work there as well. And Rashi says, "V'su hamuter asur midalo hitter lava b'mamzeres elo ha'asuros lakohanim." From the fact that you're saying those who are allowed to be with the mamzeres are those who are prohibited to kohanim, hamuter b'kal kahuna asur b'mamzeres. It sounds like one who is mutter in the community of the kahuna is asur b'mamzeres. V'harei ger, but what about a ger? Kevan de islay kal gerim loikri kol. Since we already just said again, we're saying according to this shita that the kahal gerim, the community of gerim, is not considered to be a community and should be mutter b'mamzeres. But that's not going to work over here, because here you have a situation where the ger, is mutter b'kohenes, but also is mutter b'mamzeres, and so again, it doesn't work in that regard. And the Gemara continues, Ela Amar of Nasan Bar Hoshia, rather of Nasan Bar Hoshia says, Hachi Ko Amar, This is what we mean to say in the Mishnah as follows. Kol shekohen aser lisa es bito. Anybody where you have a situation where a kohen is not allowed to marry this individual's daughter. Umaynihu, and what is the individual we're talking about? Ger shenasa giores. We're talking about a ger that marries a giores, a male convert that marries a female convert. Ucha Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, mutarin lavo zebozeh. So they're mutar to marry one another. And Rashi explains, Al-Amar of Nasan, rather of Nasan says, Lo tema kol asurin. Don't read the Mishnah as anybody that's asur to enter into the community of the kahuna, because then the tikshilach almana l'kohen gadol, then you'll have a problem with an almana l'kohen gadol, because again, almana l'kohen gadol, she's not allowed to enter into the community of the kahuna, but she's not allowed to be with a mamzer and those that are excluded from the community. V'tikshilach a ger midukya, you'll also have a question by a ger, because a ger is mutter to a kohenes, and by inference, then the ger should not be allowed with those who are excluded from the community, but we're saying the ger is mutter with those who are excluded from the community according to this. Elahachi kama, rather, the way you should understand the Mishnah is as follows, then you won't have these particular questions. The Mishnah is just saying, Elahachi kama Tanakama, the Tanakama, the Mishnah is saying as follows, Kol shebito asura l'kahuna, anybody whose daughter is asur to enter into the kahuna, umay niu, and what are we talking about? The mosif hay klala al asurin li Yisrael, ger shenasa gioris, what are we adding on to the other cases of people who are asur to Yisraelim? We're adding on a ger that marries a giores. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Damer b'masnisin, it's like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov who says in the Mishnah, ger shenasa giores, that if a ger marries a giores, bito psula l'kahuna. So it says that his daughter is going to be disqualified from the kahuna. That's what we say later on, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, mutarim lavo zebazeh. So those individuals, meaning essentially the converts, those individuals are allowed to be with those who are excluded from the community. V'hainu ger mutar b'mamzeres. That's exactly what we're saying above, that a ger is mutar with a mamzeres, umamzer bo, and a mamzer is mutar with the ger, meaning to say it's the same basic thing, but now, since we're phrasing it as anybody whose daughter is asur to the kahuna, we don't have the questions that we had above. The ilu beger shenasa Yisraelis. Now, if we're talking about a ger that marries, let's say, Yisraelis, lo matzis lo ukma, you can't be talking about such a situation. The man shamat le da'amar kohen asur lisa bito, because who's the one that holds that a kohen is not allowed to marry the daughter of a ger that marries a Yisraelis? That happens to be Rabbi Yehuda. That's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. T'amar b'masnisin bas ger zacher kebas cholol zacher. That's Rabbi Yehuda's shita. Umi the sefer Rabbi Yehuda, the katani Rabbi Yehuda oser. Now we can't say that the beginning of our Mishnah follows Rabbi Yehuda, because the end of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. It says Rabbi Yehuda oser, so reisha lav Rabbi Yehuda. So clearly the beginning of our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda. That's why we specifically have to say it's following Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, talking about a ger that marries a gioris. Lachi mukmi lok Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That's why we say that the beginning of the Mishnah is following Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, because we can't say it's the other shita. We can't say it's Rabbi Yehuda. V'shamei Rabbi Yehuda l'tanakama de'islei kal gerim lo ikri. The point is Rabbi Yehuda then heard the same as above. Rabbi Yehuda heard the Tanakama of our Mishnah say that the community of gerim is not considered part of the community, and therefore they're allowed to marry those who are excluded from the community. Upalagola, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on the Tanakama of our Mishnah. But the Gemara continues, Uchlalahu, is this really a rule, the Chol Shekohen Asr Lisa Bito, that anytime you have a situation where a Kohen is Asr to marry this particular person's daughter, Mutarim Lavo Zebazeh, so those individuals are allowed to marry those who are excluded from the community? That's not really true. Hare Cholol Shenasa Bas Yisrael. What about a situation of a Cholol who marries a Bas Yisrael? A Cholol, again, is a Kohen who is profaned from the Kahuna. If he marries a Jewish girl, the Kohen Asr Lisa Bito, so a Kohen is actually Asr to marry his daughter. Vasurinami lavo zebazeh, yet that person is excluded from being with those who are excluded from the community. So the rule does not work in that case. And the Gemara says to that, Lokash, it's not difficult. Rabbi Dustoi ben Yehuda, because we're following Rabbi Dustoi ben Yehuda. Rabbi Dustoi ben Yehuda actually holds that if a Cholol marries a Bas Yisrael, a Kohen is not prohibited from marrying the daughter, and therefore the rule still works in this particular case. But the Gemara continues, Vare Cholol shenasa chalala, fine, but what about a Cholol that marries a chalala? The Kohen asur lisa bito, because in that case also a Kohen is asur to marry his daughter. The asur nami lavo zebazeh, but again those individuals are asur. The Cholol is asur to marry those who are excluded from the community. Vesu, and further, you can also ask the following question by inference. Ha mutter asur, it sounds like those who are mutter, meaning if the daughter is going to be mutter to the kuna, it sounds like those individuals are asur to those who are excluded from the community. V'harei ger shenasa bas Yisrael, what about the case, we mentioned above this case, a ger that marries a Bas Yisrael, the Kohen mutter lisa bito, so we said again, a Kohen's allowed to marry his daughter, umutarin lavo zebazeh, yet they are mutter lavo zebazeh, again that's a situation of a ger, that's mutter to be with those those who are excluded from the community, because the community of Gerim is not considered to be a call. And so the Gemara instead says, Ala Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rather, Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avua says, Hacha mamzer me'achosu, mamzer me'eshes ish, ika beinayu. The difference over here between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda is talking about a situation of a mamzer from his sister, a mamzer from an eshes ish. That's the machlokus. Tana Kama the Tana Kama holds afilu mamzer me'achosu nami have a mamzer. Even a mamzer from his sister is considered a mamzer. Rabbi Yehuda savar, but Rabbi Yehuda holds me'eshes ish have a mamzer. If it's from an eshes ish, that's called a mamzer. Me'achosu lo have a mamzer, but from his sister, that's not called a mamzer. And Rashi explains, mamzer me'achoso means to say krisus, meaning there was a violation of kares. A brother was with a sister and they had a child, but that violation of a brother with a sister is a violation at the level of kares. And then you have a case of mamzer me'eshes ish. You have a case of a mamzer from a situation of a married woman. A man is with a married woman, where we're talking about misas bezin. That's a higher level. There's a chiyuv of misas bezin when you're with an eshes ish. So ika beinayu, that's actually the machlokus in our Mishnah between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. Lav beger ifligu, meaning to say it's not talking about ger like we said above. Ela dekasavar yesh mamzer mechayve krisus. The issue over here is that the Tana Kama holds it's considered to be a mamzer even if it's chayve krisus. V'achi kamer, here's what it means to say: Kol hanoladim meisure erva mamzerim. Anybody who is born from a prohibition of arayis is considered a mamzer. Umutarim lavo zevazeh, and all the mamzerim and all those excluded from the community, they're allowed to be with one another. Hani chayve krisus bivnei chayve misas. Even if you have a situation, for example, of a mamzer from a chayve krisus with a mamzer from a chayve misas, they can be with one another. Kagon eshes ish, chayve misas would be like eshes ish. The kulan mamzerim him. They're all considered to be mamzerim. That's what the Tana Kama was actually saying. For Rabbi Yehuda also, but Rabbi Yehuda says no, that's prohibited. Lavo chayve krisus bivnei chayve misas. To say that a mamzer from krisus, from chayve krisus, should be with a mamzer from chayve misas bezin, they're not allowed to be with one another. To kasavar, because Rabbi Yehuda holds ein mamzer elame chayve misas. It's only considered a mamzer if it's chayve misas bezin. V'tayim meforish beYevamis. The reason for this is explained in Yevamis. But the Gemara continues, if that's the machlokus between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda, my kamashmal, and what is it teaching us? What's the chiddush tanina? We already learned that machlokus in a Mishnah. Ezehu mamzer said, what's a mamzer? Kolshu below yavo. Anytime you have a situation of low yavo, a prohibited relationship, divrei Rabbi Akiva, that's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva holds even chayve lavin is considered to be mamzer. Shimon Hateimani Omer, Shimon Hateimani says, Kol shachayavin all of kares b'dei shamayim, any kind of relationship where there's a chiyuv of kares, v'halacha kedvarav, the halach is like him. Rabbi Yoshua says, Kol shechayavin all of misas bezin. Anytime you have a situation of a violation at the level of misas bezin, only that is considered to be a situation of mamzer. And Rashi says, Tanina pluksa achrisi v'maslisin b'tanoi achrini. We have a machlokas already with other tanoim. V'loma leilu Rebbe lemisni letarti bavi. Why does Rebbe have to teach it twice? Nisni hasam legavi Rabbi Yoshua v'chein hoy Rabbi Yehuda Omer kedvarav. By Rabbi Yoshua, it should have said that Rabbi Yehuda also agrees with Rabbi Yoshua. Again, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that when you're talking about chayve krisus, that's not considered to be mamzer. Shehu below yavo. Again, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva is anyone was lo yavo. Afal b'she'enu ela belav. The point is, even if it's just a violation of a lav, according to Rabbi Akiva, havlad mamzer, the child is still considered to be a mamzer. Kol shachayavin alosa be a kares b'dei shamayim. The next opinion was there has to be at least a chiyuv of kares. And then the last opinion, kol shachayavin all of misas bezin, aval chayve krisus lo. Only misas bezin, not chayve krisus. The time of the kulu mefarish beYevamis. And all the reasons of these different shitas is explained in Yevamis. And the Gemara continues, Elama Rava, rather, Rava says, Ger Amoni uMoavi Ika Beinayu. The difference in the Mishnah between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda is, let's say you have an Ammoni and Moavi that convert, that's talking specifically about a male from Ammon, or a male from Moab that converts, V'hachi Kamer, and this is what the Mishnah is saying, Kol ha'asurim lavo b'kol, anybody who's prohibited from entering into the community, Umaynihu Ger Amoni uMoavi, who are we talking about? We're talking about a convert who's from Ammon, or a convert who's from Moab, Mutar and Lavo, Zebazeh, so they're mutter to marry those who are excluded from the community. But the Gemara asks on that, if so, my Rabbi Yehuda Oser, why would Rabbi Yehuda say Oser? Of course these individuals who are excluded from the community are allowed to marry others who are excluded from the community. Rabbi Yehuda would certainly not dispute that. And the Gemara says to that, Hachi Kamar. So according to this approach, this is what the Mishnah is saying. Afal Pisha Rabbi Yehuda Oser ger b'mamzeres. Even though Rabbi Yehuda is the one who prohibits a ger from marrying a mamzeres, because he holds a ger is considered to be part of the community and therefore that is prohibited. But Hani Mili ger, that's only true by a ger, the roy lavo bekal, because he's permitted to enter into the community. Avol ger amoni umoavi, but Rabbi Yehuda would actually admit there is no machlokis between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama when it comes to a ger from Ammon and Moab, unlike a regular ger. The ein ru'i in lavo bekal, because those individuals are not allowed to enter the community so low. So in that situation, Rabbi Yehuda would not prohibit it. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ben Teisha Shanim v'yom echad, if you have a boy who is 9 years old in a day, Ger Ammoni u'Moavi, he's a convert from Ammon and Moab, Mitzri v'Adomi, Kusi u'Nesin, Chalu Mamzer, a Mitzri, Adomi, Kusi, Nesin, Chalu Mamzer, all of these individuals, Shabo ala Kohenes v'ala Leviya, if they have relations with a woman who is a Kohenes or a woman who's a Leviya, v'al Bas Yisrael, or let's say they have relations with a Bas Yisrael, with a Jewish girl, Paslua, so then they disqualify her. Rabbi Yossi says, Kol shezaro posel, anyone whose children is disqualified, so then he disqualifies. V'chol she'ein zaro posel, eino posel. But if his children are not disqualified, he does not disqualify. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, and we'll take a look at Rashi over here. Ben tes shanim v'yom echad shehu ger amoni v'chula. We mean to say an individual who, let's say, is a ger amoni who is 9 years old. The point is that 9 years old is old enough to have relations. So if any of these individuals, these prohibited individuals, so to speak, have relations, paslua lekohenes min hatruma. Let's say they have relations with a kohenes, she is now disqualified from truma. Umin hakahuna, and from the kahuna, ulevia v'yisraelis milinase od lekohen. Let's say it's a levia and Yisrael. So then they are disqualified from marrying a Kohen through this act of relations. And then comes along Rabbi Yossi and says, Kol shezaro pasel, if the individual's children are pasel min ha-kahuna, if they're disqualified from kahuna, posel es ishto min ha-kahuna, then he disqualifies his wife from the kahuna as well. Ulekaman mefarish my beinayo. The Gemara later on will explain what is the difference between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph.